meant as the most accurate possible description of the mind of a child. So that's a kind of example. And elsewhere, my first theory of language acquisition used a theory of language that was not orthodox Chomskyan theory, but the variant that Joan Bresnan had worked out, precisely because there were fewer levels of abstract deep structure that were very different from what a child heard, and that made it easier for me to develop a theory that described what happened from the child's point of view. So that's a difference in linguistics. In terms of larger questions, of, say, the larger place of language in the story of what makes humans and of human nature, two prominent differences are the role of evolution in understanding language. I think that if you're going to say that something is innate, it's a kind of responsibility to then explain, how do we get it? How did I get here? And in the case of innate structures, especially ones that are said to be highly complex, natural selection is the only process that we know of in science that can result in the evolution of complex, adaptively complex innate structures, and it seems hard to deny that language is adaptive for a species like ours that lives by its wits and that exchanges know-how and that cooperates and so on. And so therefore, a complete story of language wouldn't stop with it being innate, but would then ask, what role did it play in human evolution? What were the selective advantages of having complex grammar as opposed to not having it? Chomsky definitely does not see it that way. Not only is he militantly agnostic about how language evolved, not that he denies that it could have evolved by natural selection, but doesn't see how there's any insight gained by describing it that way, but also has become, I think, increasingly in recent years, hostile to the very idea that language is in some sense a system designed for communication. That, in fact, language is... Chomsky has quotes that says...
Who left?
You think I'm...
Out.
Now, just because there's almost this, for someone who doesn't know Chomsky's writings, this might also almost sound like a mischaracterization or a straw man or a caricature, but I assure you it is not. And Chomsky has written, language evolved for beauty, not for use, and in fact is unusable. People can, it is very hard to know exactly what one could mean by that, especially given that the argument is itself couched in language. But indeed, Chomsky's skepticism about evolution extends far enough to say that there's nothing about language that's particularly well adapted for communication, that people use it for communication in the same way that they use hairstyles or clothing for communication, but there's no sense in which you can understand its function to be communication. And so that's an idea that I consider unhelpful, would be I guess one way to put it.
But you know, I mean, I sort of like that idea, and I'm trying to figure out what there is. I mean, why is there in our different approaches? And I wonder if it isn't this notion of what you said, which I thought was really rather, for me, it was an eye-opener, that you don't, the actual forms of language for you are really, they mean an awful lot. So if you are led to Rin, you think, well, wait a minute, this is really getting off the stream. But notice, what about the other things? Like, you see, if you look at Rin alone, you're right, but what about insane, insanity, the whole business of the vowel shift being there? I mean, that can't be an accident. You know, so so my feeling is, if you're going to have the vowel shift in the language, the great vowel shift is a major phonological change that took place in English around 1400. Actually, it took place between 1400 and 1700. The first change in the great vowel shift was at 1400. It's why Chaucer is different from Alfred, for example. And then the next one, the next one was with Shakespeare, and why. And then the final stage of the great vowel shift took place in I think the early 18th century. And in any case, the thing is that if you look at these historically and then you look at modern English, the rules are still there. So, and you probably agree with that. I mean, as you said, it's a beautiful construct, yeah. SPE. So my feeling is, if you're going to buy that, RIN is inexpensive.
Yeah. I think there's an empirical question. When you have regularities that are left over from historical shifts, and certainly the great vowel shift and your own work on it is something that anyone interested in the English language should know about, because it affects so much, such as why we have such crazy spelling, which is not so crazy when you consider the great vowel shift, why the English spelling differs from that of all the other European Roman alphabets.
Right.
So it does explain a lot. The question is the proper locus of the explanation in history, or is it still preserved in our psychology? That is, does ontogeny recapitulate linguistic phylogeny, and do children, as Chomsky and Halley actually said, do children in deducing linguistic forms literally trace out the historical evolution of the English language, which is a main part of the Chomsky-Halley theory, which doesn't necessarily follow, at least in the psychologist sense, of actual mental processes that going on in the brain of the child, as opposed to a perspicuous kind of account of what the child ends up with. Mm-hmm. And it's possible, I think, that some of these historical regularities are acquired not by retracing the history, but by learning the patterns as associations in memory, without actually having deeply stored in memory the original historical form and then kind of retracing its history when you use or learn the word.
One of the, I wonder how you feel about this. As you were talking about the influence that these people had on you, I was thinking, I mean, you never met Chomsky when you had read his article. I was influenced by Chomsky because I had actually been invited to join RLE, and I'd never met him, and I was invited up here, and I remember meeting Chomsky on the steps of Widener, and we went into the Niedicks across the street, which isn't there anymore, for a cup of coffee, and he was telling me about his work on SPE. Well, I had just been given an opportunity to go to England, and I loved England, so I was going to go to England. But then I talked to this guy Chomsky, and I realized I had to. He offered me a year here, and I realized I had to take it. You know, no matter how much I liked England, this was somebody who was coming at language in a completely different and, for me, startling way. And I just wanted to share this with you because when I decided to study, to come to MIT for a year, and by the way, the reason why they were interested in me was because I happened to know something about the history of the language. I knew nothing about the theory, but I knew an awful lot about the history, and they were interested in looking at the history from somebody who knew. But what became apparent to me at that time was that there was a real watershed in the field, because if Chomsky and those guys were right, then all the people that I had studied with were not merely wrong, but their work was worthless. Now that's a terrible thing to happen, and that was the strength, that was the engine that ran the so-called linguistic wars. Yeah. You see, and this is something you missed, because I think the battle had already been won by the time you came into the field. But when I came into the field, I came in at a time when there was a fight, because there were still the older giants of the field. And then here's Chomsky, and if he was right, I mean, you know, it's not bad to be wrong in a field.